In November 1835, a council of roughly 1,000 people gathered on a windswept beach called Te Awapatiki on a remote island 700 kilometers southeast of mainland New Zealand. For 3 days, they argued. Their island had just been invaded by nearly 900 armed strangers who arrived crammed onto a stolen European ship. The younger men in the crowd wanted to fight back. They outnumbered the invaders more than 2 to 1. But the elder said no, because 5 centuries earlier an ancestor named Nunuku had sworn an oath that his people would never again kill one another, and that oath had somehow held for 24 generations. Within weeks, roughly 300 of these people were dead, hundreds more enslaved, and a population that had lived on that island for hundreds of years was pushed to the edge of extinction. That island was Rikohu, the Chatham Islands. Those people were the Moriori. And what colonial writers did with their tragedy afterward became one of the most convenient lies in the history of the Pacific. A lie that ancient DNA has now torn apart, bone by bone, gene by gene. Before we go any further, if this kind of buried history grabs you, drop a like on this video and subscribe with notifications on, because we are about to walk through one of the most quietly explosive genetic reversals in the entire Pacific. And you will not want to miss where the trail leads next, all the way to a coastline on the opposite side of the ocean. Share this with someone who still repeats the version of this story they learned in school, because by the time we are finished, that version will not survive the conversation. What makes this story worth sitting with is not just the reversal itself. It is how long the wrong version survived, how confidently it was repeated by people who should have known better, and how much damage a convenient falsehood can do when nobody has the tools to check it. For 100 years, nobody did. Now we finally do. For well over a century, the story most people were handed about the first arrival of humans in New Zealand was simple, tidy, and almost cinematic. Polynesian voyagers, the ancestors of the Maori, sailed across the open Pacific in great double-hulled canoes, found an empty, forested, mountainous land at the bottom of the world, and settled it in total isolation. That much of the old story is actually true. But colonial writers in the 1800s did not stop there. European settlers, surveyors, and government officials, the same people busy redrawing who owned what land across New Zealand, began pushing a second story alongside it. They claimed the Maori were not first at all. They claimed an older, gentler, more passive race had lived in New Zealand long before any Maori canoe arrived, a race that was supposedly conquered and nearly wiped out when the Maori landed. That vanished race got a name. Writers called them the pre-Maori people, and they linked this imagined lost race directly to a real living community, the Moriori of the Chatham Islands, the same people who had just survived, and largely not survived, the 1835 invasion. For more than 100 years, this was not some fringe theory whispered in obscure journals. It was printed in school textbooks. It was recited by teachers. It was repeated in government reports and newspaper columns and quoted in courtrooms during land disputes. An entire country grew up believing that the Moriori were a separate, older, doomed race, and that the Maori had done to them exactly what colonization would later do to the Maori themselves, and that detail mattered more than it might first appear. If you can convince a nation that the people already living on a piece of land had themselves once displaced an even older population, you create a very useful kind of moral fog. Land claims start to look shakier. Displacement starts to look like an old repeating pattern rather than something a colonial government was actively doing in the present tense. Doubt, in the hands of a colonizing power, has always been a tool worth keeping sharp. Think about the mechanics of that argument for a second, because it is worth spelling out plainly. A government negotiating treaties and drawing new property lines across an entire country benefits enormously from a population that has already been taught to see its own indigenous history as a chain of conquest and displacement, rather than as one continuous, legitimate presence stretching back centuries. If displacement is just what always happens here, then the newest wave of displacement looks less like an injustice and more like history simply repeating a familiar shape. That is precisely the function this myth quietly performed for well over 100 years, largely unexamined, largely unchallenged, and largely unquestioned by the very institutions that kept printing it. The problem is that the story was never true, and it likely was not even believed by careful observers at the time it was first written down. It took modern ancient DNA analysis, a technology that simply did not exist when this myth was invented, to finally put the question to rest for good. Bones do not carry a political agenda. Genetic material pulled from centuries-old burial sites does not care which government wants which version of history to be true. It just holds information, waiting for someone with the right tools to finally read it honestly. So let us go back to where this entire migration actually began, because the real story turns out to be even more astonishing than the myth it replaced. Genetic evidence collected from Maori communities across New Zealand lines up almost perfectly with a well-supported model of ancient human movement out of the island of Taiwan, beginning somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. It sounds almost too strange to say out loud, but the deep ancestry of the Maori and of Polynesian peoples more broadly traces back to small farming and seafaring communities on Taiwan. From there, generation after generation, their descendants pushed south through the Philippines into islands Southeast Asia and finally out into the vast open water of the Pacific, along a path archaeologists call the Lapita expansion. This was, by scale, the single largest maritime migration in the history of our species, carried out with no compasses, no metal tools, no satellite navigation, and no written charts of any kind, only inherited knowledge of stars, swells, wind, and bird flight passed down through voice and song. Picture what that expansion actually required. There were no engines to fall back on if a canoe missed its target island by 50 miles. There was no rescue vessel waiting over the horizon. There was only memorized knowledge of star paths, the shape and rhythm of ocean swells, the flight patterns of certain seabirds, the color and temperature of the water itself, and generations of accumulated experience passed down through voice and chant. Entire families sailed together, carrying food stores, breeding animals, seed crops, and sacred carvings, trusting a body of inherited knowledge that had never once been written down. That kind of voyaging does not happen by accident, and it does not happen once. It happened again and again across thousands of miles of open Pacific for well over 1,000 years before a single canoe ever reached New Zealand. Within roughly 1,000 years, their descendants had reached Samoa, Tonga, and the heart of what we now call East Polynesia, islands like Tahiti and the Cook and Marquesas groups. Then, sometime around the year 1300 AD, a fleet of these voyagers pushed south into far colder water than their ancestors had ever sailed and found land no human being had ever set foot on. New Zealand was the largest habitable landmass left completely untouched in the entire Pacific. The people who stepped off those canoes became the ancestors of the Maori. This part of the story is not folklore. It is backed by archaeology, by radiocarbon dating, by ancient DNA pulled from early settlement sites, and by something colonial-era historians spent far too long refusing to take seriously: Maori oral tradition itself. For generations, Maori communities preserved their own history through carefully structured forms, whakapapa genealogies that traced descent across dozens of generations, and named waka traditions describing the specific canoes their ancestors sailed in. Outside, historians spent decades dismissing these as colorful legend rather than real evidence. But when geneticists ran actual population studies against these oral records, the two lined up in a genuinely striking way. A landmark 1998 study of mitochondrial DNA across Maori and wider Polynesian populations estimated that somewhere between 50 and 100 founding women were needed to produce the genetic diversity still visible in Maori populations today. That number matches almost exactly with oral traditions, describing roughly 8 to 10 founding canoes, carrying perhaps 5 to 10 women each. That is not a coincidence anyone can wave away. That is centuries of memory, carried with no written language at all, holding up against hard population genetics. Now let us turn the camera fully onto the Moriori, because this is where the old colonial narrative collapses completely under its own weight. The Moriori are not a myth, and they are not some vanished chapter in a museum display. They are a real, living community today, with strong ancestral ties to Rikohu and neighboring Rangihaute, roughly 800 kilometers southeast of the New Zealand mainland. For generations, the story taught in schools said the Moriori were the original inhabitants of the mainland itself, a peaceful, passive people who were nearly exterminated when Maori canoes first arrived. It was, in effect, an accusation of ancient genocide handed to one indigenous population about another, a story that shaped textbooks, shaped courtroom arguments, and shaped an entire nation's sense of its own past. Genetic and archaeological research tells a completely different story, and it is one confirmed directly by New Zealand's own national encyclopedia project, Te Ara. The Moriori are Polynesian. Their DNA ties them to the exact same Austronesian voyaging tradition that produced the Maori. Current research indicates the Moriori came to the Chatham Islands from the New Zealand mainland, and quite possibly also directly from East Polynesia, sometime around the 14 or 1500s. They were never a separate older race conquered by Maui canoes. They were relatives, carrying the same language family, the same navigational knowledge, the same genealogical traditions, who settled a remote and brutally cold set of islands, and then evolved a distinct culture in isolation over the following centuries. In 2011, the Marsden Fund committed over $800,000 specifically to combine archaeological evidence with ancient DNA analysis of Moriori remains, an effort led in partnership with the Hokotehi Moriori Trust. Precisely so that scientific data could finally be tested against generations of oral history rather than against a colonial guess. And what the Moriori built on those isolated islands deserves to be described in full because it complicates the old condescending image of a passive, doomed people beyond recognition. Sometime in the 1500s, after violent conflict broke out between different groups on the islands, A chief named Nunuku Wenua intervened and forbade killing and cannibalism entirely, an act of will that became known as Nunuku's Law. This was not some vague folk custom. Weapons were symbolically surrendered. The covenant was ritually renewed generation after generation. And it held, not for a few years, but for roughly 3 centuries, right up until the moment in 1835, when it was tested in the most extreme way conceivable. An armed invasion, the Moriori chose to meet with nonviolence rather than break a promise made by their ancestors. That is not the behavior of a broken, defeated people. That is a society sophisticated enough to consciously choose peace even while staring down annihilation. And Moriori descendants today still describe Nunuku's Law not as a historical curiosity, but as a living inheritance. Sit with that for a moment. Imagine growing up as a Moriori descendant, being told by outside experts with total confidence that your ancestors were a doomed primitive race erased before real history even began, that your family's memory of who you are and where you came from was simply wrong. And then imagine ancient DNA quietly arriving decades later to say the opposite, that your family's memory was right all along, right down to details that outside scholars never even bothered to check. There's no need for a dramatic musical swell to make that land. The science answers. The dignity simply returns, quietly, on its own terms. There's also something worth saying about the invasion itself, because it is easy to let the genetics overshadow the human cost. The people who arrived on Rikohu in 1835 came from 2 North Island tribes, and they came because a European ship, overcrowded and desperate for cargo, offered them a route to new territory. The Moriori who greeted them at first treated the new arrivals as guests, sharing food and shelter with people who had just survived a grueling voyage. Within weeks, that hospitality was answered with conquest. Descendants of the survivors still carry the memory of that betrayal alongside the memory of Nunuku's Law, and any honest account of this story has to hold both truths together, the extraordinary discipline of the peace covenant and the devastating cost that discipline carried when it met an enemy willing to exploit it. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle anyone who studies this seriously. The false story about the Moriori did not survive for 100 years by accident. It survived because it was useful to exactly the people who benefited from it. It gave a colonial government a way to soften its own record by pointing to a supposed earlier act of native conquest. It gave a legal system a convenient way to muddy land ownership questions during treaty disputes. It gave settler society a kind of moral cushion to rest on. The myth did not collapse because it was bad scholarship, although it always was. It collapsed because ancient DNA finally made bad scholarship impossible to defend with a straight face. Now here is where this trail stops being a story only about New Zealand, because the same voyaging tradition that reached Aotearoa did not stop there. It reached South America. For decades, the accepted picture of Polynesian expansion was a closed triangle. Hawaii in the north, New Zealand in the southwest, Rapa Nui, known to most as Easter Island, in the east, with no meaningful contact reaching beyond that triangle in any direction. That picture had one stubborn hole in it from the very beginning, the sweet potato, known across much of Polynesia as kumara, a plant domesticated thousands of years ago in the region of modern Peru and Ecuador. There is no plausible natural pathway across that much open ocean current and salt water for an unmodified root crop to drift there on its own, and researchers have known this for a very long time. In 2020, a team led by Stanford researcher Alexander Ioannidis published a study in the journal Nature that finally settled a debate historians and archaeologists had argued over for decades. Before collecting a single sample, the research team spent years visiting the communities involved, explaining the study and securing informed consent, because this was not going to be genetic history extracted from people without their voice in the process. By collecting and analyzing genetic samples from more than 800 living people across 17 Polynesian islands and 15 indigenous groups along the Pacific coast of the Americas, from Mexico down to Chile, the team found identical by descent segments of Native American ancestry embedded directly inside Polynesian genomes on multiple islands, including the Marquesas, Palliser, and Mangareva, alongside Rapa Nui itself. Nobody expected to find that ancestry signal on islands as far from South America as the Marquesas. Most researchers had assumed that if any contact happened at all, it would be confined to Rapa Nui, simply because it sits closest to the American coast. Finding the same genetic thread scattered across islands thousands of miles apart meant the story was bigger than anyone had guessed. The genetic signature pointed to a single shared contact event, meaning this was not centuries of repeated back-and-forth travel, but very likely one voyage or one small group whose descendants then spread that ancestry outward across island populations that followed. The dating on that contact event lands remarkably close to the year 1200 AD, hundreds of years before any European ship ever crossed into that part of the Pacific. On Rapa Nui specifically, the admixture appears to have occurred later, closer to 1380, even though the island itself had already been settled since roughly 1200, suggesting Polynesian voyagers reached the coast of the Americas independently of, and before, their own arrival on the island closest to South America. Separate research into the sweet potato's own genetic lineage, tracing its shared ancestry with wild South American relatives, lines up with the same broad picture, a plant that made the crossing east to west and became a staple crop across the Pacific centuries before Europeans ever mapped that ocean. Think about what that actually means. Polynesian navigators, sailing the same double-hulled canoes their descendants would later use to reach New Zealand, crossed one of the widest stretches of open ocean on the planet, made contact with people on a continent thousands of miles from their home islands, and in at least some cases turned around and sailed home again, carrying Kumara and shared ancestry back into the heart of the Pacific. That happened roughly 3 centuries before Columbus ever left a European port. This is not a story about accidental drifting. This is a story about the most capable deep water navigators our species has ever produced. And modern genetics is the only reason we can say that with real confidence today instead of simply suspecting it. If any part of this has made you rethink something you assumed was settled, take a moment right now and send this video to one person in your life who still believes the old, tidier version of this story. That is genuinely how a 100-year-old myth finally dies for good, one honest conversation at a time. There is something important buried underneath all of this that goes beyond migration routes and DNA percentages, and it deserves to be said plainly. For decades, Maori communities were told their whakapapa, their carefully preserved genealogies naming specific ancestors, specific canoes, specific generations, was not real evidence, just colorful oral tradition that could never measure up to written colonial records. And yet when geneticists finally did the actual population science, those oral records were not replaced. They were confirmed independently by an entirely different kind of evidence that had no way of knowing what the old stories said. That is not a small academic footnote. That is a form of vindication that took more than a century to arrive. This pattern is not unique to New Zealand either. All over the world, Indigenous communities have had their histories written by outside observers who arrived long after the fact, observers who often dismissed oral tradition simply because it did not resemble a European-style written record. Ancient DNA is quietly forcing a correction to that pattern, one population at a time, moving disputed questions out of the realm of ideological argument and into the realm of testable physical evidence. That shift matters far beyond academic journals, because these old, false narratives were never just stories sitting harmlessly in a book. The false Moriori myth shaped land policy. It shaped how treaty negotiations were argued. It shaped which communities were believed by officials and which were quietly pushed aside. Correcting the record is not a nostalgic exercise. It has real consequences for real people living with the aftermath of that record today. It is worth pausing on just how recently this correction actually arrived. Genetic sequencing technology, capable of reliably reading degraded, centuries-old DNA out of buried remains, is a development of only the last couple of decades. That means for roughly 150 years, the false version of the Moriori story simply had no serious scientific challenger. Nobody could open a bone and check. The myth survived not because the evidence supported it, but because nobody yet possessed a tool sharp enough to contradict it. That is a sobering thought applied more broadly. How many other confidently repeated historical claims, sitting right now in textbooks somewhere in the world, are simply waiting for the right laboratory technique to finally catch up with them? Somewhere around this point in the story, it is worth pausing to ask yourself something a little more personal. Think about your own family history for a moment. Some story an elder told you that got waved off by other relatives as exaggeration or nostalgia, or an old person's fading memory. Hold that thought for a second, because the Moriori and the Maori spent 100 years being told the exact same thing by people with far less right to make that judgment than your own relatives have about your own family. Sometimes the dismissed story is simply the one nobody had the tools to verify yet. Let's take one final wide view before closing this out. New Zealand was one of the very last major land masses on Earth reached by human beings, settled only around 1300 AD, while much of the rest of the world had already been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. In the few centuries that followed, the ancestors of the Maori built an extraordinarily sophisticated society from scratch, developing advanced systems of oral genealogy, distinct carving and weaving traditions, deep expertise in seasonal agriculture and long-distance navigation, and complex diplomatic and social structures, not because they were new arrivals figuring things out slowly, but because of the depth of knowledge they carried with them from thousands of years of prior Austronesian voyaging. The Moriori took that same inherited toolkit and adapted it to one of the harshest, most isolated environments in the entire Pacific, building their own peace-based legal tradition that held for roughly 300 years, under conditions that would have broken most other societies. Neither group was a footnote in someone else's story. Both were distinct chapters of one of the most remarkable human migrations our species has ever attempted. The Maori were never who a certain colonial paragraph claimed they were, and neither were the Moriori. Not because either group turns out to be smaller or simpler than the old story suggested, but because the truth is larger, more skilled, more deliberate, and more deeply rooted than any 19th century settler account ever allowed. Ancient DNA did not rewrite these people's history. It stripped away a layer of political convenience that had been sitting on top of it for 100 years, and what is left underneath is a genuinely extraordinary human story, one that was always sitting quietly in the bones, the whakapapa and the waka traditions, waiting for the tools to finally catch up with the memory. That is really the larger lesson sitting underneath everything we have just walked through. History is never a finished document just because enough textbooks agreed to repeat the same paragraph for 100 years. It can be reopened. It can be corrected. It can be handed back, intact, to the very people it was taken from, especially now that the tools exist to check the old claims against something more honest than convenience. Sometimes the version we were told was the small one, and the real story was always waiting patiently in the bones for the rest of us to finally be ready to listen. If this changed how you think about even one detail of what you were taught, drop a single word in the comments describing exactly how it made you feel. And if it made you think of someone who still repeats the old version of this story, send it to them tonight. Because some corrections are not just about the past. They are about the people living with the consequences of that past right now, who deserve to finally have the record set straight. If you made it to the very end of this one, subscribe and tell us which buried history you want unearthed next. Because there's a lot more still sitting quietly underneath the surface.